Hello and welcome to the Alpha Demo and Q&A webcast. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Product Management here at Alpha Software, and I'm pleased to be joined by Sarah Mitchell, our Director of Customer Success and Head of our Documentation Department. Today, Sarah will be continuing on with a demo at the very beginning of the presentation, but we are here also to answer your questions, and you could type those questions into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. So let's get started. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, how's it going?
Great, thank you.
How's everybody doing today?
It's a nice day.
I assume everybody's doing great.
All right.
No news is good news, right? All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have been paying attention, you may have seen rainbows in every single presentation this month. That was on purpose. But today is the last presentation of the month. There is a theme. If people want to guess the theme in the questions box, that'd be right. Go for it. But just to continue on, we always talk about, or at least I try to talk about this first off before we get into our topics. The webinar schedule next week, micro interactions, the winner of our poll, and then following that, we're going to have a webinar on the new Alpha Anywhere release, which will ideally be out by then. And then on the 20th, there will be a deep dive into some features. And then on the 27th, the second most popular voted item in our poll, building custom web themes. So we will talk about that. And however many sessions it takes to get through that, that's what it's going to be. So with custom web themes, it's rather involved if you're going to go all custom. So I want to make sure that I leave you guys with enough information to go out there and be successful. But I want to avoid overloading you with like an everything brain dump that leaves you overwhelmed, because that's not going to help. So we're going to try to break that down into small digestible pieces, starting in July through August. And then after that, it's DevCon. So if you haven't registered yet, please go online, register for DevCon, do it today, because in one more day, prices are going to go up. So now is the best time to register. We have been lining up the presentations. We've started developing the content. We hope to see you there. It should be great. And so that's coming up soon. Note that week that we will not have any webinars because we'll be doing DevCon instead. So just keep that in mind. And then, following all that housekeeping, we are going to talk about working with UX controls today. So,
are you going to, is your screen paused and are you showing different slides?
Oh, it's paused. I'm sorry.
I'm sure they were brilliantly I'm sure on your end it was awesome.
All right.
All right.
Is it not paused anymore?
Now, ooh, very nice graphics.
All right. So just a reminder, this schedule.
Perfect.
There we go. Yep. Please register for DevCon. And we're going to talk about working with UX controls today.
Nice. Is that Pac-Man at the bottom there, though? I was just wondering.
It could be.
See that? And it's eating the little dots? I don't know.
It looks like a pie chart.
I'm easily amused. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So last August, we actually did an introduction on the UX component. And if you have not watched that webinar, we're going to build off of some of the information in that webinar today, or maybe go over a little bit more of it in detail. I've posted the link to that so you can go watch that if you haven't seen it before. But just as a refresher from that webinar, and the UX component, which is your core component for building an app, web, mobile, there has a bunch of controls you can add, and those controls are added on the controls pane in the UX builder. And there's several different types of controls. We have data controls, panels, containers, other controls, which are controls that have less, well, we'll explain on another slide. And then defined controls, which are complex controls that we group together. So this is a refresher. Data controls, they're often used to display or collect information. We have a whole JavaScript API for reading and writing values, hiding them, showing them, doing all sorts of stuff with them with JavaScript. And there's a lot of, some of the common data controls that you might see are like a text box, drop-down box, checkbox, list control. A map is a data control. Really anything that you can display or collect data from. Other types of controls we have are panels for organizing controls into screens. These are meant to be responsive: panel cards, panel layouts, panel navigators. We've done a presentation of this recently. It has a client-side API for displaying and creating panels dynamically if you need that, but these are mainly for organizing your data controls, or containers of data controls. Containers are used to organize your controls on screen. They can be placed inside of frames to draw like a box and a label on it, or put in like tabs or accordion controls, or pop-up windows, special containers that contain things that you might want to inject somewhere else. Injectable container, you could put controls in it and then display those controls dynamically by inserting them into a pop-up window somewhere else or inside of another object. And an alignment container, which is a fancy container for aligning your controls. A new one that isn't mentioned here, but the CSS Grid is a type of container for arranging your content. Other controls also used to display or collect information. They often do not have a get or set value API. So things like a button. A button doesn't have a value, but you can certainly use it to create an interaction or gather more data. Static text for displaying some static content. Embedding another component, using the PDF viewer to view a PDF. Those types of controls are other controls. And then defined controls are complex controls with a predefined function. So your like record navigator for your list control, or the SQL trace log, which is a debugging tool you can add to the UX to get a readout of what types of SQL queries are being run when you're doing an insert or an update on your lists. And then also like two-factor authentication. All of our editor set, pre-built editor sets are in there, which work with the form box, which we have not, or form view, which we haven't even talked about, I think, in any demos recently. So that's just a quick rundown of what the different classifications of controls are. We're only going to look at today some basic controls. So we're going to look at some basic data controls and some basic other controls like static text, the text box. And what we're going to talk about really is like, how do you configure these things? All the controls in Alpha Anywhere have a property grid that you can use to configure those controls, and you can do things like, specify the controls ID or customize the look and feel, add in custom calculations, implement events, so on and so forth. And I've classified these into different types of settings. So you have your general settings, which often show up in this thing called field properties. There's settings that every control has. On occasion, field properties might actually be the actual like control specific settings, like the button properties have their ID specified within the button properties, not a field properties section. But there are common properties shared among all controls. There are control specific settings. So you can see here switch properties. I have very specific settings for configuring things like the on and off state. Label settings, the field label, where's that label shown? What is it? What's the text in it? Any optional styling you want to put in there? Bubble help. If you've got a mouse, you could hover over it, get some help text there. We have some server-side settings and client-side settings for doing things like show hide expressions. Security settings for controlling who has access to view something, and those are generally applied on the server. JavaScript events, which not everything has a JavaScript event, but most things do. And then finally, data binding, which I want to talk about, but I also encourage you maybe avoid it, and I'll explain why when we get to that. So this is the property grid here on the right-hand side that you'll see when you select a control in the UX Builder. And some of the things that you may want to consider configuring with your controls, especially data controls, would be like control name, giving your controls a reasonable name if you plan to use it with JavaScript, or even in Action JavaScript if you want to reference a control, getting away from the default text box 1, text box 2, text box 3, and giving an actual meaningful name like first name, last name, city, state, date, that kind of stuff. That's something that you're probably going to change either when you first add the control or maybe later down the line when you change your mind. The data type, which only applies to data controls, but that specifies the type of data. Is it a character data type, a date data type, a numeric data type? The default value. If you're building a form to collect information, perhaps you would like to default a date value to the current date. You would set that up through the default values. Validation rules, which can happen on the server or the client. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do there. Yes, the general setting is also where you can customize layout breaks. Does your controls use a new line created after the control in the layout, or does it stay in line with whatever is going to be displayed next, as well as your show hide rule. So the hide control is actually just strictly like, is it visible or not? It's a checkbox. And then control container customization. Every control is placed inside of a container. That container takes up space. The control is not visible, but you can control that through some customization options that we have, which might be important to you if you're dynamically showing and hiding your controls and you want that space to either collapse completely or maybe retain it because the layout is dependent on that. Things that are more specific, which on this slide now I'm kind of regretting putting all this busyness in here, but every control has specific settings to configure it, and whether that be the choices for a checkbox, a drop-down box, the button text shown on a button, the switch has its own properties like on and off value, sliders have a minimum and maximum value that you can configure. All that information is going to be control specific. So I've got a list here of a few settings that you're going to find in different types of controls. So like a text box has the HTML5 type, which may or may not be important to you. HTML5 type is a way to tell a box like, hey, you're a color or a date value, and kind of take advantage of some of the built-in browser functionality for interacting with that control when it's rendered. Choices, drop-down boxes, checkboxes, radio buttons, they all are a list of choices of some kind. Choices is something specific to that control, which you configure through their specific properties, and then also the slider and the switch. Label settings, not every control. Most controls can have a label, some can't. You'll know because you won't find the field label settings in the control properties when you select it. But the label is usually present for most, and it's optional. You can tell it not to display. That's part of the position settings. But if you do have one, you can customize what the text is, where it appears, any kind of custom styling options you want to apply to it. Bubble help, which is a mouse triggered event, displays help text if the mouse hovers over the bubble or over the label. May not be important to you if you're building mobile apps, but that's available to you. And then alignment, is it on the left side of the control, the right side? Sorry, not the control. Is it on the left side of the container that it's rendered in, the right side, centered, that kind of thing. Server side and client side settings are going to be things like show hide expressions, enable expressions. If it's a text box, you can have a computed value. You may want to display additional data in your app that isn't necessarily data you've stored, but you can compute it. So an example of that would be, suppose you're displaying an invoice and you'd like to show a total of everything in the invoice. You may not store that total in your database, or maybe you do. But if you don't, you can certainly compute it with a text box that's set up as a computed value. And that you would find within your client-side properties. There's also some stuff in here. You may find it on onGet value JavaScript, on set value JavaScript. This is really an event. Pardon me, got lost in my notes here. But you know, these types of things are sprinkled in and around that you can add your own behaviors or customize things. Maybe you want to transform the value of that control before it's displayed into a format or a different value, and then transform it back to what it was on the way back out. An example of that might be, maybe you always display your content in all caps or sentence case. There are JavaScript functions available for making that transformation before you render your data. You can also use something like a display expression to transform data, or a mask, such as with phone numbers. But those are going to be types of things that you find within your client-side settings and your server-side settings. Show hide expression. The The big thing to know on those two classes of settings is the server-side settings get computed on the server before your app is sent to the client, and the client-side properties happen on the client right there. So if you've set up something with a server setting and whatever that expression that it's based on, it changes, you do need to make a callback to the server for that to be updated. It's not going to happen automatically. Another thing that's applied server side, unless you explicitly make it a client side option as well, is security settings, which can be used to control who can see some control together. So if you've got the security framework running and you've got controls that display information that you don't want certain people to see, or you only want certain people to see, you can use security settings to just strip out the control completely. It's not even sent to the client if they don't have permissions to view it. Note that this will take a little bit of extra time to compute the interface before it is sent to your to the person who's viewing your app on whatever it is that they're using, the mobile or the web. But that is a very powerful tool for you to make sure people can't access information that you definitely don't want them to see. JavaScript events is something I'm sure everyone's going to want to use eventually. This is how you add behaviors, trigger workflows, perform actions like saving your data when someone clicks a button, or navigating to a new page if someone taps on a control. But you can do so much more with it. You can dynamically compute other values or update controls, show hide controls, all sorts of stuff when something is clicked or changed, or if somebody mouses over something or presses a specific key on the keyboard. There's all sorts of different things you can do with JavaScript events. And in Alpha Anywhere, they are broken into two sections. One of them is the touch mouse pointer events, and the other one is just JavaScript. I think it used to have some extra text after this, but it did not in the screenshot I pulled today. But the stuff in touch mouse pointer events is going to be, we call them abstract events that work with touch interfaces. So a mobile device or a computer that has a monitor that accepts touch input, which lets you do things like swipe up and down the screen or tap. These prefer to use these if you're doing something like a click or a double click. They are optimized for those touch interfaces. The stuff that you see in the JavaScript section, which is shown on the bottom half of this picture, these are going to be your mouse events, your keyboard events, and then in the case of change, focus, and select, blur, not all controls have these, but it's a behavior that happens when something like, so you're working with a text box, then you tap on something else. The act of taking the focus away from that control and giving it to another. So you're leaving that text box, and now you're going to go, change a value in a drop down box. That's considered an on blur event. You're leaving it. The focus is being lost. You could trigger an action that happens when that happens for a text box. Same with on change, or like on focus. If somebody gives focus to the control, maybe you want something to happen. Keep in mind that not all controls have these events. If you go in and you enter some JavaScript in on one of these events and it's not being triggered, it's probably because the control doesn't support that event. The JavaScript section just lists all of them. It does not make a distinction between the different types of controls that support them. And then lastly is data binding. It's usually the last section that you see in that property grid if you scroll all the way to the bottom. And what data binding is a mapping of a data control to a field in a database. There is a section in the UX Builder called data binding. There's a picture of it here on the right. What it lets you do is bind fields on your UX component to fields in a table. It doesn't work offline. This is actually predates the existence of the list control. So if you've never used this before, please consider just using the list control instead, primarily because the list works offline and has been optimized for mobile and all those sorts of good things. But you can use this. Data binding is usually used with repeating sections to create an interface that you can, enter data in and then save it, and it gets updated into a database. Doesn't work offline. Keep that in mind. Usually only in web apps does it get used. But yeah, if you haven't used this before, use the list instead. If you see it and you don't have data binding set up, you can ignore all those settings. They're not going to be used. And they do not apply to a list control if you're using a list as your data source. And that's a really, really fast run through because I wanted to talk a bit more in a live demo. And before we get to that, is this going to work? Let's see here. Well, there we go. If you have questions, email guides@alphasoftware.com. But let's get into it. So I have already launched Alpha Anywhere. I've already created a UX component. I'm already in that UX component. I've already added a bunch of things. And what I've added here is I've added some data controls, and I've added some other controls, which are found in the other section. And just to give you an idea of what's in here, we've got a text box, we've got some check boxes, we've got a drop-down box, 2 sliders, 2 switches. And if we come over to other controls, we have some static text, a static image, a button, and a placeholder control, which currently doesn't show anything. But just wanted to talk briefly about how I've gone through and used those properties to change what's inserted by default into what you see here. So starting with the text box, I've done something very simple here. By default, when you add a text box, the text boxes are all rendered with something called a base sub theme. And since I've mentioned that, I'm going to come over here to Web Projects Control Panel. Let's open the Web Style Builder. Let's make a copy of orange. We'll store it locally. Call it orange copy. So this is a copy of the Alpha Orange system theme, and I did not copy it correctly. Let me go back here. I needed to detach it from its base theme, which simply do that. Local detach. So Alpha Orange is it's an inherited theme. It modifies the alpha theme with a few other things. And the only thing that gets stored is those modifications. So by detaching it, it actually gives us access to every single thing that is defined in both the alpha and the orange theme. So if we come down here and we go look at edit, edit is used for text boxes. It has something that appears here called edit base right here. This is a sub theme. And by default, base is what you're going to get. It's just an underline. There's nothing special about it. But what I've done back here in this particular text box is I've changed it. I've come over here to the text box properties, and I selected the sub-theme property, and I changed it to primary, which puts a box around it, which is a very fast way to go in and customize the look to be something different using sub-themes. And most controls support sub-themes. It provides a way to create a different look for something. In our buttons, we have a lot of them because buttons in a lot of designs out there, like material design, you have a bunch. Buttons have different looks for different reasons. Like you might style your primary buttons, the action that you want the user to do. Those might be like a big solid background fill, white text, very bold, very colorful, very in your face. Well, something you may not want people to do, but you want to provide it for them anyway, like a cancel button. You may make that a lighter color. So with the text box, configuring this, I've come in here. I didn't like the original, so I've picked primary out of here. If I don't like primary, there are ways in Alpha Anywhere to create new subthemes. So you could come over to properties, style subtheme and CSS tweaks here, and then create a new subtheme based on edit. We find edit here. Maybe you want a copy of that one. We'll click out primary too. Just click OK. And now if I go in and customize things, I can take advantage of that here and pick primary too. So I copied primary, so it's going to be the same. But if I had customized it, I can change that look here. I could also change the HTML5 type. There's a bunch of pre-built ones in here, like color, date, time, local, email, telephone, URL, week. But with respect to text boxes, there's so many other things. Like we have something called a Google address select or suggest, which means that you've got a text box for capturing an address. You could use this feature to auto suggest addresses based on the database stored by either, I think it's just Google, but I do believe Nomatim, if we come in here, is another option. No, this one just uses the Google API key. So you could go up against Google's database of addresses and use that to suggest an address as somebody's typing it out. All your read-only watermark, is it a password? If you check that, it turns it into a password field. So there's a lot of settings right here for customizing that look and feel of your text box. Similarly with the checkbox, if you look at checkbox properties, again, we have things in here for allow subtheme, converting it to a JavaScript control, which gives you full control over the look and feel of the checkbox. This is actually a new feature. It's going to be in the next release, whether or not you want to display it as checkbox or button lists, so on and so forth. And then those choices themselves can be built out of a variety of ways. This is a static list of choices, yes, no, and both. Same with drop-down box. This is also has choices here, but these have been configured to pull all their data from the Northwind database, from the territories table. In fact, let me open this up here so you can preview that data. What it's going to pull down is it's going to pull down a description of the territory from territories, and then it stores a different value, the ID. So if you were to get the value of this control, it will return this ID, but it will show the user something that actually makes sense, like Hollis. They're 03049 is useless for your users. They're not going to know what that means, but they might know what Hollis is. And then sliders and switches also have customizations here. I've got an example here of the difference between a one value slider and a two value slider, which simply has this two value box checked. There's a bunch more you can do in here. You can display a message which shows what the value is on the slider itself. I've also set these up to have a default value because with the slider control, if it doesn't have a default value, and especially in the case of a two value slider, both of the handles are stacked on top of each other, which visually makes it look like a single value slider. So that may not be the experience you want to give your users. So in that situation, you may want to consider setting a default value of like 0 to 100. Maybe you want to show the min and the max value there, or maybe you've got something specific that you want to display like a range. Maybe you've got a slider set up that's going to let you pick like a range of dates or over time. So maybe it's all the months of the year, but maybe you just want it to show the last 2 months. So you might set your default value to the last 2 months of the year. That can be done here. The data type on the slider, interestingly enough, is actually set down in the slider properties rather than up here in the field. And then the switch control has some customizations for on-off value. The example here that I wanted to share with you guys is how would you do like a enable expression. So if we look at switch 2, it has a if switch 1 is equal to on, this control is enabled. So come over here. So right now I'm clicking on this, but it's not doing anything. If I click on 1, this is enabled. So now I can click on it and it's on. And this becomes even more evident when I turn this back off while that's on. See how that turned gray? It's disabled. I can't change it. And then here's that example of the slider with default values. You can actually click and move this thing here, so that's kind of cool. Can't do that with a one value slider. You can only pick that one value. But in the case of the two value, again, if these were all set to 0, this is what you would see. and on the at a glance, it looks like there's just one button, and then you click and drag it, and you're surprised that you have a range there. Here is territories, or drop-down box. And then I didn't explain it, but decisions actually has some JavaScript in it to force this to behave a little bit weird. And the way it behaves, it's evident that this should actually be a radio button. But what it does is if you click yes and no, it automatically selects both for you. And if both is already selected and you select no, it deselects both. Same if you pick both, it unselects whatever choice you picked over here. And on that checkbox, that was done through the onChange event. Open that up. And this is the JavaScript for it. It uses, I forget what this is called in JavaScript, but it's a function. It's a function syntax. But what it does is it gets the value of the checkbox, which is an array, because checkboxes can have multiple values. And it searches it for yes and for no, and if both are there. So if both of these functions return a value that isn't undefined, it sets the checkbox value to B, so for both. Otherwise, if its length is greater than 1, so something was selected and I selected something else, it's going to have a length of 2 at this point, and it finds that B was selected, it sets the value to the value that was chosen, which is actually passed in on the this.value object to this event. And then I set the value here to value. I wrapped this one in an array. I did not wrap this one in an array. Both work, so take that with a grain of salt. But that's an example of using an event with some JavaScript. I could very easily go and use like an action JavaScript to maybe enable or disable a control. That's one of the actions that we have when something changes, as well as use that enable expression on the client-side expression properties, or the client-side properties. But this is an example of something you may want to do. There are use cases out there where you may want to provide a checkbox control that lets you, select some things, or have an option at the bottom that's like all of the above, which if you pick that, maybe you want to check everything, or maybe check nothing and only check that one value, but that's a way you could do it. On other controls, this is less, there isn't much configuration that I did here. We'll take a look at how the static text was set up, how we set up the image, and then this button, which when you click, it actually populates the placeholder control. But that's done over here on other controls. So static text is a very useful control if you are needing to do something like you want to insert some instructions on the page somewhere and you want to like show hide it. You can put those all in a static text control. In this example specifically, I actually used the static text control label to add a label to the placeholder control, because this is a control, which is an example that doesn't have a label. Placeholder is meant as a space where you could put something like error messages or some debug output. If you're using the list and you want to see the search results that have been generated on a search, you can put those into a placeholder control. It's used to kind of add a place for displaying extra information either during your development or even after it's shipped, if you really need to show something on screen, and that text is being generated by Alpha. That's what the placeholder can be used for. And while it is not a data control, it does support the get value and the set value commands on the dialog object to set information into it. So that's how I populated this placeholder control. I used this function, dialog object set value, and I just set some static text in there when that button gets clicked. This is text mode on the button. With this static text control, all I did was enter in some static text into the HTML editor. You can do any HTML you want in here. It's supported. And then the image, which if you're adding images, especially if you're going through ad control, you're going to see a couple. There's one that's image data bound, which is going to be used with your list with detail view, or if you are using data binding, it's a data control, an image data control. So you can set the value, get the value, you can bind it to a database to save that however you need to. If you come down here into the other control section, there's another one. It's just an image, a static image. If you want to insert an image, a logo, I think might be the most common use case for putting in just a static image that you want to display something, but it's not going to change. That's this image that was added here, and then configuring that, because it's static, you just set up the image name. This is actually base64 encoded image that I found for free on the internet. Did not need to contribute any kind of credits or anything when I found it. I found it on Pixabay. It's a site I like to go to. And encoding this is pretty easy. I think I talked about this a couple webinars ago, but I forgot that if you click select and just go off and find an image and then pick it out of this picker, we encode it for you, so you don't actually have to go off and find some website to set that up for you like I did on that demo. But that's a static image I've added. I did some extra customization on it by specifying some image style in the image properties here. So the width and the max width, this is where I constrained it to be slightly smaller than it actually is. It's like a 600 pixel wide image, and I wanted it to stay smaller than that. If I didn't want to do some inline styling, I could have picked a class or created a class name and applied it here. And then the image title, I believe, will populate the alt text on the control, which is very important for a lot of reasons. For people who can't see, providing an alt description of the image conveys to them what it is that's actually there. It's also important if you're doing SEO optimization to make sure that you have a description on your images. The algorithm loves that. And so, advanced display options here. We looked at the button click. With respect to these events, you do not have to implement just one. You can implement as many as you like. Let's go do an example here on text box. Or sorry, not text box. Let's see here. Let's do one on double click on checkbox. And actually, let's do action JavaScript on this. We'll do a message box. We'll keep a simple message box, and we'll say double clicked is the message that it'll display. Oh, it wants my message to be wrapped in single quotes. Let's go back and make sure that's the case. Double clicked. There we go, save that. So that was our checkbox control. As we click on it, see it still does the behavior we added in the other one. But if we double click it really fast, it triggers that double click event. So you're not limited to one. You can implement however many you need on your controls. And then I didn't really talk about it much, but up here in field properties, variable name checkbox 1, if you click here, you can give it a new name. It's going to show you a list of the existing variable names. It has to be unique among the controls on the page. If you try to pick something that's already in use, it's not going to let you use it. But that is used in JavaScript. So if we go look at our onChange event here, See this checkbox 1? That's our control name, and that was set up there in that property. If you change it and you've already implemented something, either action JavaScript or you've got a client-side script somewhere that references the control by the original name, you do need to remember to go and update them all. So make sure you do that. It's not going to automatically do that for you. The type character, if we wanted to make this numeric, we could change that to a number, and then we'd have to go into our choices, and instead of using Y, N, and B, we'd do something like 1, 2, and 3. Excuse me. And then for simplicity's sake, we're going to get rid of all this logic here by commenting it out. And what we're just going to do alert value to alert what that value is. And this will be triggered every time the value changes. So we check here. Now it's 1. 1 is the value. Check both, 1, 3. It's an array, but its values are 1 and 3, the numeric values, and not the string values. So I just want to do a quick reminder of what is available to you in control properties, and then we can take questions. So just as a, just working with controls, you have these different types of settings. You have your general settings, where you set your variable names. Didn't get into validation rules, but there's I feel like 1,000 videos on that explain it very, very well. To validation rules are 100% you should use them if data integrity is very important to you and you know up front specifically what people should and should not be putting in there. Put it in through validation so that you don't have to run some sort of script later down the line when it's trying to get into your database and then kick it back out to them saying, oh, you did it wrong. Just put that up front, prevent them from entering characters they're not even allowed to. That can be done through the validation rules themselves, configuring, restricting what values can be entered. For each specific control, you're going to find all the settings to configure that control, buttons, switch properties, in a section that's literally called like the type of the control with the word properties after it. Label settings for displaying or removing the labels if you don't want it. Server-side and client-side settings to help you control whether or not the control is visible, enabled if it's a computed value, as well as control over transforming the value of the control itself with the on value set, on value get, something that you can take advantage of to really customize that data transformation for your users. Security settings, if you're using the security framework and you want to restrict access so that people can't even find it in the HTML if they open up the debugger in the browser, security settings can be your friend in that case, as can the server-side settings. JavaScript events is where you're going to find most of your events for hooking in your own behaviors and workflows. And then finally, data binding is a section used with UX data binding, and most of you probably will not touch that. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
All right, yeah, so 2 questions right off. One is, okay, so when you're working with controls, let's say you build a control that you like, and you want to like save it for use later, but you want to put it not just in alpha, but want to put it up on GitHub to share with someone else. Is that a possibility?
So it depends on how you've built the control, but
Okay.
if it's, is it like an interface you've built with complex controls, like, a few check boxes and a radio button, you could just save that as a standalone UX control and then put that up in GitHub and share it with somebody else. If it is which we did
I think Dion did a custom
presentation on
control.
this. No, yeah, Dion did a discussion on this the other day. Let me see if I have one in here. Badge fun. All right. He actually made a custom control.
Yeah.
And that was built using the UX, or not the UX, the ViewBox control. So this is the only way to get to it right now. I've been meaning to put in a feature request for you guys to make this easier. But if you've built a custom control there's a Save as Custom Control button, and let's give it some sample view box custom control. This one. All right. Save as custom control. Okay. If you click on Manage Controls here, it's going to open up a folder. And this is where all your custom controls get saved. So if you've created one, like Dion made badge fun, and I apologize I haven't gotten this up on the internet for you guys just yet. The thing that you would share is this entire folder, and that folder would need to be placed inside the user-defined UX controls directory on your whoever you're sharing it with. This directory doesn't get created until you've actually saved one, so they will have to at least make a placeholder to get it added. And the only way to get to this, if you do not know where it is, it's actually in the the app data roaming alpha software alpha anywhere installations, and then the name of the installation, which is generated from some combination of the directory, so on and so forth, and then a folder called user defined UX controls.
All right.
Hard to track down, but once you have it, that's the folder you need to share, and they need to put it in their custom controls as well. Just as a side note, I believe if they...
But you could put that folder as a part of a GitHub repository, isn't that
You
right?
could put that folder up in GitHub, 100%, yeah. The other controls that you see in that more dialog are also stored in a custom controls folder in the installation directory. So there's something called UX custom controls here. That's where you're going to find all of these. Don't quote me on this, but I think if you put that in here, it will also show up. I don't know what will happen though if you do an update on that on Alpha Anywhere and we have to modify that folder. So it's better that you put it in your local user directory.
Now, there's another question here that's by someone sort of related, which is, what if you were when you're in the UX control, or sorry, the UX editor, in the menu there is from the menu drop down, I guess. There is something like save selected controls to library or something like there it is.
There is save controls, yeah. So you could save that in here, and that will add it to the other controls section, or not other controls. That actually puts it down here in defined controls. So if we wanted to save those guys there, some switches, sorry, sliders and switches.
And it looks like you've got 3 different levels in which you can save it.
Yeah, so that's going to save that. We'll save it locally in this project, which would make it available here, I presume. It's possible this won't update right away.
So if you save that,
you might have to insert it from here.
Gotcha.
Load control from library, sliders and switches.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So you could make that global so that you could get to it from all your projects as well.
Yeah. Oh, too few parameters. I'm not 100% sure where that gets stored. I think if we come into the project, so let me back it up. This button on the Web Projects control panel will open the Web Projects folder, which is, this one is UX controls. And there's dialog control library. So that's where it saved it. These 2 files here are the ones you would need to commit to GitHub, and so somebody could add it to their project in a folder called dialog control libraries. It's another way you could do it. You could also copy paste, but that's gonna, this copy selected controls to clipboard will put all the code on the clipboard for that control definition, and then you could then paste it from the clipboard. Yeah, the got you with that is if you go that route and then like save it in a file and then like try to select it out of the file to paste it back in, there's a risk of not capturing everything because these control definitions are quite long. You can actually look at them if you click on the XBasic tab. Yeah, they're very long. It's all this stuff. So yeah, you just run the risk of not getting everything.
Now, I'm sorry, I think I'm missing the context for this question, but maybe you can pick it up on it. And it goes, what is the value and off value properties for?
So the on and off value properties on a switch control.
Ah, right there.
I
Okay,
assume
thanks.
that's what they're talking about. So
Yep.
it's the value that triggers the on state and off state. So when you insert a switch control, it's going to populate those automatically for you on and off. But if you go and you map that to a control, say in your list control, and a field that can have two states, maybe it's 1 and 0, then the on value would need to be 1 and the off value would need to be 0 in terms of like the
So this tells
underlying
Alpha.
value of the control itself.
So it tells Alpha Anywhere, yeah, what data should trigger the on state or the off state when it's
Right. Yeah. And, you
in
know,
the UI,
if it's numeric, not
and vice
date.
versa.
I don't even know why it hit it. I might need a state character for this guy. 1 and 0. If it's numeric, I think we might make an assumption where if it's 1, it's on and 0 is off. If it's a date, I don't even know why we let you pick a date type for a switch control.
Well,
That
it's
doesn't make
either
any sense. But
it's either
again,
your
this is
birthday
just
or it
like a
isn't. Yeah.
generic field properties.
Yeah.
So this is a setting that all of our data controls have. Sometimes it doesn't make sense what we give you, but in terms of type. Yeah, so that's what on value and off value let you do. It defines what value triggers the on state and the off state.
So earlier on in your presentation, when you were going over the design of controls, someone asked about the tab pane and specifically the label part of a tab. Can you make adjustments on the look and appearance of that?
On a tab pane control? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so let's go grab one. We'll make another panel here.
Okay.
We'll insert a container, a tab pane control, and we'll add tab 1, tab 2, insert after. And just so that it has text in it, we'll add a few static text controls. So it's tab 1. This is tab 2. And I don't know if you saw it while I was working on that, there was a little red block of text up here that said it had layout errors. You can't add a tab without something in it or it doesn't like you.
Okay.
The tab label is where you would change that text. So, you know, tab 1. And if I select tab pane here, tab 2. And then this is our tab control. And if we go here into either one of these previews, both are great. And I go to panel card 3, this is tab 1, this is tab 2. This is showing the default subtheme for the tab control. I could make that look the same as my panels by changing its subtheme here. The subtheme setting in the tab according control properties. And flared is the one that I've been using here.
Yes, that's the one people often think of when it comes to tabs.
Yeah, it's a common one. I mean, changing the background color too, but still being square is another way to do that. So there's the 2 tabs. On the panel cards, if that was the question, how did I get my panel navigator, which is rendered as a tab band set to the flared subtheme to display a different label than the panel card name itself? It has something called a display name property that you can set. And that's where you can change that. So we could change this one here to say tab controls. Click out of it. And there you go, tab controls.
Awesome.
So that should answer the questions.
Very cool. And
if not, let us
know. And back to loading controls, there is an option apparently right there in the menu. If you go back up to the menu,
the menu
drop down, yeah, the little widget, that there is a load controls from library.
Yeah, there's a load controls from library here. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Not seeing a lot of other questions right now. So I think we're going to end it for today. But of course, if there are more questions, go ahead and send them into guides, GUIDES@alphasoftware.com. Sarah, thank you very much for presenting today. Thanks everyone for showing up and asking questions, keeping it lively. We hope to see you at our next Alpha Demo and Q&A webcast on Wednesday. Until then, take care and stay well. Bye-bye.